Hello.
Hey everyone.
Hi. Welcome to Scottish Developers, our first meetup in a while. It's good to have you all with us. I can see some messages saying hello in the chat, so we'll give a few minutes for folks to join us, and then we'll get started. And hopefully you all can see my screen. I think I can see it in the video. So we've got quite a busy agenda for tonight, so we'll say hello and some welcomes. It's been a while since I meet up. And then we've got Stephanie with a talk on the future of HTML controls. And then we have Gary with a talk about cake, which a cake delivered, so I'm a wee bit disappointed about that. And then I'm just going to let us know a bit about what's next for Scottish Devs. It's our first meet up in a while, so we've got some plans for how we're going to keep things going.
Cool.
Cool. Continue just reading, seeing folks saying hello. If you've got any questions or anything throughout the meetup, you can use the YouTube chat, or you can tweet with hashtag Scottish Developers or at Scottish Devs and say hello, give us feedback, ask questions, anything like that. It would be great to hear what you think. And I think that's all we've got. Andrew, is there anything else before we kick off from you?
No, everyone will hear from me at the end, just with some follow-up stuff and what we're going to be doing over the next few months. But...
Sweet. Well, I will say goodbye to you for now. And I'll say hello to Stephanie. Hi, Stephanie.
Hello.
How's it going?
Good.
I'll stop sharing my screen and I'll let you share yours.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right.
Cool.
That all good?
Perfect. I'll add you in then. So would you like to introduce yourself to us?
Yeah. So I just want to say I am, per usual, thrilled to be here. I'm joining from Seattle today. My name's Stephanie, and I work at Microsoft, and I'll go into a little bit more about what I do at Microsoft here in a minute. But I am really thrilled to be able to join virtually today. I have to say I would so prefer to be in person with you all, and I hope I can do that sometime soon. I love Scotland and miss visiting. So today I'm going to be talking about the future of HTML controls and styling them and extending them, and touch on some of the really exciting work that's being done to improve these, what I consider essential pieces of web UI. So I have a lot of content to cover, so I'm going to go ahead and dive right in.
Yep, I'll say goodbye. See you soon.
All right. So my name's Stephanie, like I said, and I'm a program manager for Microsoft Edge on the developer experiences team. I'm quite fond of calling that my fancy title because underneath that program manager title, I am a designer and a front-end developer and a developer and designer advocate for Microsoft Edge and the web as a whole. So in my former life as a designer, who was also responsible for the development of building the site that I had designed, I became all too aware of the issues around designing websites and using native form controls and having difficulty with styling them and getting them to render across different browsers the same. So compared to what I was rendering, or compared to what was rendering in different browsers versus my pixel perfect mockups that I would show clients, it often felt like this. It was a little bit off. And clients would frequently ask me, like, why do things not look exactly like your mockup that you initially showed us? And why doesn't Internet Explorer look exactly like Chrome does? And at that time, I didn't understand the web platform or realize that the root of this issue was beyond me as a designer and a front-end developer. And so I understand the pain points around styling controls and trying to get them to look the same across browsers. And so today I am hoping to demystify some of these pain points for you all as well as talk about what's to come to help sort of relieve some of that pain, because there's some really exciting stuff in the works. And so today we're going to talk about the past, why HTML controls are the way they are, the present, where we're at now, and the future, what's to come with HTML controls, and select specifically, because that is the first control that people are starting to look at. And so to understand how we got to where we are today with controls and the problems we have, we need to review some history, and we need to go back to the beginning of the web. We need to go back to 1995. And so 1995 as a whole was sort of a good year, especially in terms of like pop culture. It brought us a lot of good things. It brought us Xena, Warrior Princess. It brought us the Macarena. Starbucks Frappuccinos were introduced. Windows 95, one of my favorite operating systems. And perhaps the most important thing in the history of the web, in my opinion, the HTML 2.0 specification. So this specification is interesting to me because this was the first standard for HTML that was ratified by the W3C. There wasn't an official HTML 1.0 specification. There was a draft that had been circulating around in the early 90s, but what that had covered was extremely basic in terms of features. And so that ended up expiring in early 1994. And that was replaced with the HTML 2.0 draft. And that incorporated what was in HTML 1.0, but its main job was also to go ahead and document and standardize what was already out there in web browsers feature-wise without breaking functionality. And this was the early days of the web, so you might be thinking that there can't have been that many browsers out there in the early 90s, but there were actually quite a few. And so there was a library of code that basically provided the building blocks of a web browser to developers. And so between 1991 and 1994, all of these different web browsers popped up. And because HTML was so feature sparse, all of them started implementing their own HTML features to fill out feature gaps. And so this rift in HTML continued to grow up until HTML 2.0. And so HTML 2.0 standardized what was out there in the web, and with it we get our first form controls and the standardization of form functionality. So this provided a standardized method for users to enter data into an HTML document, and for that data to be used to perform an action such as logging into a website. And this is key to our issues with form controls. So it standardized the method only. It didn't standardize the form parts or how they were constructed. And so now we have some standardized HTML building blocks to build websites, but it's early web days still, and we are still missing something. We're lacking a standardized styling language. So CSS wasn't actually supported by the HTML standard until HTML 3.20 in 1997. And it wasn't even until 1999 that browsers really embraced and supported CSS with the HTML 4.01 specification. And so if we go back to 1995, we've got our form controls, but we have no styling language to style them. So browsers ended up having to rely on the operating system to render and style those form controls, which led to a technical dependency on the operating system. Later, even with those early versions of CSS, because of the technical dependency on the operating system and the way they were being rendered, there were parts of form controls that CSS just wasn't able to access. But the other side of this was that browser vendors were extremely reluctant to make controls stylable because they were also a reflection of the operating system's visual appearance. So the idea that developers would want or need to make form controls look different wasn't really a concept. And when it finally was sort of accepted that this was something developers wanted to be able to change, we were given the appearance property. But this only controlled system level styling, and developers actually didn't use it for its intended purpose. And it ended up not being implemented as designed across the different browser engines, which then led to many interoperability issues between browsers with different vendor prefixes and other issues. And the support for this varied so widely across browsers that it was really hard to rely on this to change the appearance of your form controls. And the browser that had dominant market share in the early 2000s, Internet Explorer, didn't even support it. So there were a lot of issues with the appearance property. And so that was a lot of very quick history. So to recap, pre-1995, we get lots and lots of browsers that pop up. In 94, we have the HTML 1.0 draft that expires. In 1995, we get our HTML 2.0 standardized spec ratified by the W3C. We get our basic HTML form controls, but we have no standard for styling. So this leads to a technical dependency on the operating system. And then by 1999, we finally have our standardized styling language. And so to sort of rush through 1999 to the present, lots of things happened with the web. There were a few browser wars, lots of new features were added, form controls and functionality continued to be enhanced, standards in CSS evolve and are still evolving, and we add more form controls. And so it's been 25 years since the first form controls were introduced to us, and you would think maybe we would have figured things out in regards to styling them, but I wouldn't be here talking to you if that was actually the case. So MDN Docs has some really great documentation around form controls and their stylability. And so to assess the sort of current landscape, I've bucketed them out into 3 different categories. And so our first bucket of form controls, these can be styled with few problems. These are form fields that label output, text field, input, and buttons. So have at it. You're probably not going to run into any issues with these. The second bucket can be styled with more complex CSS and hacks, and that's checkboxes, radios, and legend. So you'll probably be able to achieve the style you want. It just might be a little bit hacky. And this final bucket I lovingly refer to as the good night and good luck bucket. So these are advanced native controls. So these either can't be styled with CSS at all, or they're extremely limited in what you can style. So you can probably only style just parts of them and not the whole control. And so of those original form controls from the HTML 2.0 spec, we didn't really improve the ease of styling anything. We only have 2 in the easy bucket and 2 in the middle bucket and 2 in the advanced bucket. And then all those controls that we did end up adding over the years are all in the advanced styling bucket. And so one thing I want to note here too is that the CSS specification calls out that user agents are the ones responsible for styling controls, and that browsers aren't required to apply CSS to form controls, which is what leads us to browser inconsistencies with rendering. And so on the one hand, like I said, I come from a background in design. These are different companies. They have different design languages. To me, it would make sense that their form controls would look a little bit different, but we're building for the web, and we should be building to support things across multiple browsers. Things that serve the same function and purpose should probably be consistent, at least their parts should. And so like I mentioned previously, it was the method for entering data with form controls that was standardized and not their actual form parts. And so on top of poor CSS access to style controls and browser inconsistencies, we can't actually extend the functionality of a native control currently. And I love this tweet from Scott Gell that sort of sums this up perfectly. You have one problem. You want icons in your select menu options. You decide to make a custom select menu. You now have at least 75 problems. And that's because when you rebuild a control from scratch, instead of using the native control, you don't get all the good stuff that's already baked in from the platform, like accessibility and security. So you have to add all those things back in, and then you have to test it to make sure you did all that correctly. It is a time-consuming and bad developer experience, but it's necessary when you can't extend your controls the way you need to. And a perfect example of this is the video element. So a developer either gets all of the controls or none of them by adding or removing the controls attribute. There's no in between. And so when we want our HTML controls to sort of look like this or this, it's no wonder that we've all just reverted to building our forms from scratch. And so on the browser side, we decided to take a step back, and we wanted to ask some questions to make sure that this was an area that we should go invest in. We knew this was a pain point for developers, but we weren't sure if better native controls were something that developers really wanted. And so we asked that question, and you all really do. You're all tired of having to rebuild your form controls from scratch when the browser could provide a solution for you natively. And so my former colleague, Greg Whitworth, who is now at Salesforce, conducted a survey on form controls about a year and a half ago, 2 years ago, and he really wanted to dive deep into this space. So he sent out an initial survey on Twitter, and that survey had 1,400 respondents. And these were all people in varying roles, from full stack devs to designers, and they all had varying degrees of experience across web development. And so Greg asked respondents if they had ever used a library or a framework, or had built controls from scratch. And if they did, which controls did they create? And these were the top 10. Select was the most recreated form control, followed closely by checkbox, date, radio, file, progress, button, dialog, text area, and text. And then he wanted to know, why were people recreating form controls from scratch? And over a third responded and said that it was because they couldn't change the appearance sufficiently. Another third just wanted to add functionality, so they wanted to extend the control. And then just under a third said because of browser inconsistencies, which one can probably assume has to do with how it renders across different browsers relating to appearance. And so if we group that in with that first bucket of developers, that's over 2/3 of devs who are recreating form controls from scratch purely because of appearance. That's a lot of developer time. And so Greg followed up with an amended survey where he asked JSConf EU attendees the same thing, the same survey, but he added 2 additional questions. So he asked, which form control gives you the most frustration and why? And Select clearly stole the show, with nearly half of developers saying Select. And then he asked why, and these were some of the verbatims that he got. Select requires hacky tricks, can't style the option elements at all to the extent we need to. But the amount of work it takes to implement an accessible alternative with complete feature parity is massive. And I can just feel the pain coming from this statement. And so this prompted me to ask my own question. I wanted to know how painful it was for developers. And so about a year ago, I did my own research on Twitter, and I asked developer and front-end designer Twitter to please fill in the blank. I would rather blank than attempt to style a native select element. And it turns out people really do not like select or having to work with it or trying to style it at all. They would do some pretty painful things as opposed to working with native select. And so these are some of my favorite responses. I'll just highlight a couple here. So I would rather call each person attempting to use the form and ask them what option they would like. I would rather build the entire site in Flash. I'd rather grind my teeth to the jawbone with rough sandpaper. And this is continually my favorite. I would rather heat up a rusty old fork with a few tines snapped off and broken, and then with both arms thrust it into my inner thigh, than attempt to style a native select menu. So clearly, there is quite an issue here. It is quite the pain point for developers. So let's talk about the future and what's to come and how we're going to relieve some of that pain. So the future is looking shiny. I'm actually really excited about what's being done in standards groups and even on browser teams. So let's start with HTML. So HTML isn't done. It's a living language. It's continually evolving. And on the Edge team, we've been collaborating closely with Chrome to update controls in the Chromium project as well. And so for Chromium, our initial focus was new styles and accessibility improvements. So when Edge HTML switched over to the Chromium browser rendering engine, we wanted to ensure that we were bringing some of that good accessibility stuff that we had in Edge HTML over to Chromium and applying that to the controls. And then additionally, we wanted to bring a much needed visual refresh to the native controls. And so we wanted to lose some of the gradients and shadows and bring a much more neutral and universal style that developers can leverage while we get the standards work started for more in-depth customizations. So hopefully this lessens the time spent recreating form controls with these more neutral styles. And secondly, we're looking at new native components and elements. And so in a previous version of this talk, I had mentioned the Chrome team had taken on looking at 2 new elements. They had been looking at a native toggle switch and a virtual list, but in going to check on the status of these last week, they have both been abandoned at the moment. But this doesn't necessarily mean we won't get them someday. If these are native elements that you would like to see, I highly encourage you to let browser vendors know, write a blog post, go tell people on Twitter who work on browsers that these are things that you want, or even get involved in the Open UI group, which I'll talk about in a minute. So even though these aren't in progress, there's still hope for the future with these. But it's not all bad news. I am really, really excited to talk about a new element proposal for a pop-up element. So this proposal was just released like 2 weeks ago from Microsoft, Google, and Salesforce. And this proposal sort of evolved as the team started to look at revamping the native select, and they ended up identifying a need for a universal pop-up element. And so there are currently many cases in which a developer might need to create a transient user interface that's displayed on top of all other web UI. These are things like action menus or form element suggestions, content pickers, and even teaching UI. And so the goals of this pop-up element that the explainer sort of set out to address was that we want this pop-up element, we want to be able to contain arbitrary content. This can be fully styled, including properties which require compositing with other layers of the host web application. We want this to be able to be sized and positioned to the author's discretion. This will be rendered on top of all other content in the host web application. It should include an appropriate user input management experience out of the box, with flexibility to modify behaviors such as initial focus. And I think most importantly too, this pop-up element is accessible by default, with the ability to further extend semantics and behaviors as needed for the author's specific use case. And so other elements which are aesthetically similar to pop-ups but do not light dismiss might better be addressed with the dialogue element that currently exists. And so an opened pop-up will have this light dismiss behavior, meaning that it will be automatically hidden when one of three things happens. Either the user hits the escape key, the layout of the pop-up or its anchor element is changed, or focus is moved outside of the pop-up and its anchor element, if applicable. And so this term, light dismiss, is currently being discussed in that Open UI standards group that I mentioned earlier, that I will again talk about here in a minute. And so some examples of elements that don't have light dismiss behavior would be things like alerts or toasts, custom tooltips, and other persistent popover UI. And so a basic example of the pop-up element in action would look like this. So here we have a button element and a pop-up element. And to tie the button to the pop-up, we would have our button ID equals menu button. And we'd use an anchor attribute and set that value to the button ID of menu button. And I do want to call out that currently with the pop-up proposal, pop-up menus are not visible until show is called by the author. So there is some scripting that is required. So this new pop-up element proposal suggests that our pop-up element will have a show and hide method, but there is intent to explore a scriptless invocation. We want optional attributes for focus management, so like autofocus and delegate focus. That optional anchor attribute that I showed in the example, so that'll be used to tie pop-up to an activating element. And this will also be used in a to be published anchored positioning proposal. So there's another proposal coming, and that light dismiss behavior that I mentioned. If you're interested in the full explainer, go to aka.ms/popup-explainer. You can go read it there, file feedback. The folks who worked on that explainer are answering questions and really excited to hear feedback from you. And so let's talk about fixing the current problems with controls all up and styling them. So this is the stuff that I'm personally really, really excited about. So about 6 months ago, there was an explainer with a proposed solution for how we're going to approach enabling customization of controls UI that was released by the Chrome Edge team and Open UI team. And so this proposal for form controls is using a pattern called the MVC design pattern, where the form control is made up of 3 distinct parts, so a model, view, and controller. I'm not going to go into that pattern. There's quite a lot of information out there on the web if you're interested in exploring that further. And these were the goals that the proposed solution explainer, again, set out to accomplish. So we want developers to be able to style any arbitrary part of a native control. We want them to be able to add arbitrary content into a control, style a particular part without having to rewrite the whole UI, customize the UI without re-implementing the data model and code for reacting to user input. And again, most importantly, customized controls are accessible by default. And so we're proposing 3 different solutions that offer a range of flexibility and customization depending on what the developer wants and how much control the developer wants. And so I'm going to dive right into this first solution here. And so we talked about the history of controls, and the root of the issue is that form controls and their parts aren't standardized, and they're not reachable by developers because the different browsers have comprised the different controls of different parts. So it's not standardized. And so OpenUI is the initiative under the YCG, which is the Web Incubator Community Group, to standardize form controls and components. And so the OpenUI team, which I would like to call out is open to anyone who would like to participate, is focused on researching and documenting design systems and frameworks that are already out there today, identifying patterns in naming and use cases in controls, and using those patterns to sort of establish CalPaths for standards and eventually for browsers. And so because select was clearly the biggest pain point for developers based on our research, it was the first form that OpenUI started to research. And if you go to the OpenUI website, there is an editor's draft proposal for select, if you are interested in going to check out those sort of nitty-gritty details. And so when I talk about standardizing control anatomy, I'll use select as an example of how that sort of gets defined. And so we would define the anatomy of a select as consisting of one button part containing one selected value part and one pop-up list box part, which would be that pop-up proposal, containing 0 to n option parts. And then we would go on to define the expected behavior of a select, what happens when you click on it, and so on. And so this standardized anatomy will allow the styling of native parts using pseudo classes and the part pseudo element. So a developer would be able to change the color of a selects button in an interoperable manner without replacing any of the HTML. So in our example here, we have a CSS class called styled select, and we're utilizing the part pseudo element to target the button to change the background color. And so I want to call out here too, notice that the HTML code here is just the code of a select today. So you wouldn't actually have to rewrite any of the actual form control. We're just exposing the parts of a select and giving developers access to styling via those pseudo elements and classes. And just as another note, like there will be additional states that will also be standardized. So in this instance, the open state for the select, for example. And so that's our first proposed solution. Our second proposal would enable more powerful customization of controls and content with something called named slots. And so a set of slot names will correspond to each piece of the controls view that a developer might want to replace with their own content. So in the case of select, we could have slot equals button and slot equals list box. And that will indicate to the platform that custom content will be slotted in place. And so in addition to this, developers would also need to add a part attribute. So they would add part equals button to the button and part equals list box to the list box, which I'll go into briefly in a moment about why that's needed. And so if you've ever wanted to add like a country flag or some other sort of visual content into your list box for select, so for the dropdown, this will allow you to do it without having to rewrite the whole control from scratch. And so slots also provide the flexibility to customize only specific parts of a control. So let's take input type equals range, for example. So a developer could provide a slot and a part for just the movable thumb, and the UI for the track would automatically fall back to the default provided by the platform. And I just want to note here too, for this example, that there is quite a bit of other work that would need to be done to input that would make this solution work. But this is the ideal sort of goal. And you can check out the explainer, which I have a link to here in a moment for more detail on this. And so you might be asking, why do I have to provide a part and a slot attribute and name? And so on the platform side, we're going to wire up some code to identify elements that correspond to the required control parts. And this will apply native event handlers where applicable to handle user input. And this will also let developers make UI tweaks without having to write tons of JavaScript to handle input, and ensures that those customized user interfaces can handle all of the input modalities that users expect. So we just want to let the platform do what it was meant to do and apply those things for you. And you get that by just adding part equals your part name. And so our third and final solution is shadow DOM replacement. And so currently attach shadow throws an exception. You can't actually call it on any form control currently. And so we're proposing that this restriction be removed when enabling customization for a given control type, and calling attach shadow will end up resulting in the default user agent shadow DOM being swapped out with a new shadow root that can then be populated with content provided by the developer. And even with this solution, developers will still be required to label the core parts of their shadow DOM using the part attribute. Otherwise, the shadow DOM isn't going to render at all. And so the other thing that adding this part attribute ensures is that the correct accessibility semantics and user input event handlers get applied by the platform. So the platform's not going to make any attempt to guess at the correct behavior and just won't render it at all. And like I said before, you can just let the platform do what it was supposed to do. And I think just adding your part attribute is a small thing to do to ensure that you have an accessible and usable form control. And so I just want to give a quick shout out to everyone who worked across Microsoft, Google, and Salesforce on this explainer. They did a fantastic job this last year, and there is still so much work being done in the control space, and there are a lot more explainers to come out. So if you'd like to read the full explainer, please go to aka.ms/controls-explainer. There's a lot of technical details that I do not have time to go into today. And we need you. We need your feedback and your opinions on this work because we want to ensure that we're building the correct thing that is usable for you. And so there are multiple ways that you can get involved. So you can join the OpenUI group and help contribute to the form control investigations there. You can just tell browser vendors what you need from your form controls. If you have Twitter or listening, complain or praise, whatever, let us know. And then finally, provide feedback on the explainers. You can do that in GitHub or on Twitter. The team has been extremely engaged in responding to questions that come up. So please go give those a read. And then go ahead and follow these folks. So Melanie said is the Microsoft Edge PM leading the controls work. Greg Whitworth runs the OpenUI group, and he is at Salesforce. Stubbornella is Nicole Sullivan. She's the Google Chrome PM. And I am Ciata on Twitter. I support Melanie and Greg with OpenUI work because we are here to listen, because ultimately these improvements are for you, and we want to ensure that we are doing them, creating things that you want. So thank you.
Thanks, Stephanie. That was amazing. And the future certainly seems like more fun and less frustration than the past, definitely. Yeah. So obviously, everyone, if you can post any questions that you have, that would be great. But before I kind of hand you over to the questions, I had a question for you. Mm-hmm. It's probably unfair, but what's your least favorite browser to work with?
Oh.
Yeah, because it changes over time. Everyone knows what it used to be like 5 years ago, but
is it cheating if I say Internet Explorer? I feel like that's just a cop-out.
Yeah, I think everyone has their horror stories or hours of frustration spent with that one, certainly. What's your favorite? That's a more positive one.
Oh, well, I mean, I work on Edge, so of course it's Edge.
Yeah, that's well, everyone's baby is the best, so to speak. Yeah, I'm just gonna have a look for anything we've got. So you were sharing with us how to contribute on Open UI.
Mm-hmm.
What do you think is, if someone's particularly new people to development, it can be quite intimidating to even make your first GitHub PR. So what would you say is the best place to start if someone wants to get involved in making the web a more beautiful and easy to work with place?
So it really depends on your comfort level, but I will say that like standards groups and even the Open UI team, we are super friendly, and our weekly Zoom calls that we have, they've been growing, and I'm really excited to see more people joining. Like, just we want to hear from you. Like, we want that feedback. No one's ever, like, at least on my team and the Open UI team, we want to hear from you. So just post a comment and we'll engage with you. I know it can be super scary because it seems like a big space, but everyone's really friendly. So
Yeah, no, that's cool. So I think what time is it over there anyway? It looks like
11 a.m. Well, 11:15 a.m.
So you're just about to get to work on Edge then?
Yep.
Well, that's pretty awesome. Anyway, I'll now introduce our next speaker of the evening, who is Gary. So I'll just give a quick intro on his talk, which I believe is about a cross-platform build-in automation system, so about as far from the front end as one could go. I shan't kind of butcher your kind of title or what you do, so I'll let you introduce yourself, Gary.
Thank you very much. So yeah, my name's Gary, Gary Ewan Park. I'm from Scotland. I work full-time on the chocolatey package manager for Windows, and I'm a Microsoft MVP. So I'm here to talk today about an open source project that I work on called Cake, which is a C# powered cross-platform build automation tool. So I'll just go ahead and get started then, shall I?
Yep, please continue.
Okay, perfect. So today, we're going to talk about this thing called Cake. But before we get to that point of the innards of Cake and what it does and how it does it, I want to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing when it comes to what is a build. So what I've said is that Cake is a build orchestration tool. So what is this build that we're trying to orchestrate? Because unfortunately, that term is a little bit of an overloaded term. It's used in lots of different places and can mean different things. So to start with, when I'm talking about a build that I'm trying to orchestrate, what I'm talking about is, let's take some code. So whether it's C#, whether it's F#, whether it's TypeScript, whether it's something, typically you need to do a compile step. Now, sometimes that's called a build, but like in this context, what I'm talking about there is taking the source code and compiling it down to something. Okay, so that's kind of where the build overall build workflow starts. So in order to do that compile step, and let's talk about specifically in the .NET ecosystem, for example, then you might take in some package references. You might take in some packages from NuGet.org in order to provide logging or other parts that you need in order to compile your application. And then in order to compile your application and make it a repeatable and reliable process, you might have a clean step. So that clean step is you cleaning up the artifacts of the previous build. So to make sure that the build that you've just done will work each and every time and be repeatable. So once you've got those things in play, it's again good practice. It's an accepted good practice that you have some form of unit tests that sit alongside your code. So you'll write some tests to run your code to make sure it's working how you expect it to. So that then as you're making changes and you're moving forward, you know that your code is still working the way you expect it to. So then on top of that, you might add in some form of code unit test coverage metrics so that you can see how your test coverage is changing over time. Is it going up? Is it going down? It's one of those things that once you have that, you kind of want to have that keeping at the same level, if not getting better. Then, in order to take the thing that you're building, you ultimately want to package it somehow. So that could be as a NuGet package, that could be as a .NET Global tool, that could be as a zip file that you ultimately put out to a website. There's lots of ways that you can package up your code, but ultimately that's your process in order to get the thing that you've written out into the real world. So there's a packaging step. Then, once you've got it as a package, you then ultimately have to publish it somewhere. So again, you might publish it to NuGet.org. You might FTP it onto a website if you're doing things in an old school kind of a way, or you might have web deployments happening, or you might have some automation in play for Azure DevOps or something similar. So there's a publishing step. Now, kind of tangential to some of that stuff, in order to have a maintainable and again a reliable code base, you might add in some analysis steps. So you might add in some static development, static analysis tools like StyleCop or some Roslyn analyzers to look at your code to make sure that you're adhering to the best practices of the ecosystem that you're in. So this, to me, is a fairly standard build workflow. These are the typical steps that you would do as part of your process. Now, some of these may be automated, some of these may be done within Visual Studio, but what Cake is attempting to do is Cake is attempting to take ownership of that and orchestrating this process so that it runs the same for you on your machine, it runs the same for you or for your colleague on another machine, and it also runs the same on your continuous integration servers. So it's that build orchestration that we're trying to essentially codify. We want to define what is our build process so that we can put it into the Cake tool and then have a repeatable, reliable, and resilient build that will work the same every time that we run it. Okay, so hopefully all that makes sense. If there are any questions, feel free to ask them in the chat and I will hopefully get to them at the end. So now that we understand what a build is, let's look at, well, what is Cake? So Cake is a build orchestration tool, okay? It's an open source project, it's on GitHub. It's been around since around 2014. It was started by a virtual colleague of mine, Patrick Svensson. So it's cross-platform. So cross-platform in the sense that it will work the same on Windows, Mac, and Linux. Okay. It's also cross-environment, meaning that you can run it locally I can run it locally on my machine, or I can run it on a container. I can run it on a CI system. I can run it wherever I need to run it. It will work across different environments. Cross-service, meaning that it will run on it should run the same on AppVeyor as it runs on Azure DevOps, or it runs on Circle CI, or it runs on TeamCity. Whatever your continuous integration service is, it will work the same on each of those platforms. The other one is that it's cross runtime. So what I mean by this is that Cake as a project has evolved since 2014. So we started out with a .NET Framework runner only that would use both Mono and Roslyn scripting in order to facilitate the cross-platform nature of it. But we've also grown up to now have a .NET Core version of it. And we also have another implementation that is moves away from the Cake scripting side of things and into a console-based build orchestration tool. So there's lots of different options when it comes to Cake and how you consume it. But above all of this, what Cake provides is essentially just build definition, a build script written in C#. But we also bring with it a small DSL, so a domain-specific language. So we provide some aliases, some methods, some functionality sits on top of C#. So now that we kind of know what Cake is, the next question is, well, where can I get Cake from? So as I've kind of said, Cake as a project has evolved since it started. So you can get it from a number of places. Typically, we see folks getting it from NuGet.org initially. So you can consume both the cake.exe, which is the .NET Framework version of Cake, or cake.tool, which is our .NET Global Tool version of Cake. If you're still on .NET Standard 2.0, there is an option of running the Cake.core CLR. So again, just as the project has evolved, there are different entry points, different runners that you can use for Cake. And the final one there that I've mentioned is Cake.frosting. So Cake.frosting is the console application-based version of Cake. Now, I don't concentrate on that aspect of Cake in this talk. I'm going to be looking at the scripting version of Cake. But if you are interested in Cake.frosting, there is some information on our documentation site that I'll point you to at the end of the slides. Now, if you want to install Cake globally on your Windows machine, then you absolutely can do that using Chocolatey and the Cake.portal package. If you want to install it globally on your Mac, then there's an option of installing it with Homebrew on your Mac. And then we also have a range of containers on Docker Hub. So it's pre-installed, it's ready to go. You can bring that container into, again, your overall build workflow, depending on how that is. So with all of those things in play, how do we get started with Cake? So the recommendation going forward, now that we have a .NET Global Tool version of Cake, that is how we as a team are recommending you consume Cake. So to get started with it, what you need to do, you need to go to your project that you want to do a build orchestration for, and you would run the .NET new tool manifest command. And what that will do is it will allow you to install the Cake.tool into that manifest, so that you can pin to a specific version of Cake.tool. Now I'm going to show an example of how this all comes together, but these are the two things that you need to run once on your project that you're wanting to add Cake into. And once you've done that, then on your machine or on a CI server, what you would need to do is then you would .NET tool restore. So that will then look at the manifest file. It'll see what version of Cake you want to run. .NET tool will then be downloaded, and then from there you can then execute Cake. You could run .NET Cake, which will then start the process. Okay, so what we're going to try and do tonight, I've only got a couple more slides, but what we're going to attempt to do in the time that's left is we're going to attempt to build something with Cake. So what I've got is a very, 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 very simple Visual Studio solution, and in there I have a sample library that gets compiled as a NuGet package, and there's some other code that then gets bundled up into a .NET Global tool. So at the minute, when we're going to start this process, there is no build at all. So all that we'd have is the typical build or compile step that would happen within Visual Studio or Visual Studio Code when we had this solution open. So what we are going to want to do, and what we're going to try and achieve, is we're going to look at that typical build workflow that we had before. I've condensed it a little bit, and just in the interest of not having enough time to go through every single aspect of it, but we're going to look to take that project, that solution file, and we're going to look at compiling all of the projects contained within it. We're going to run the unit tests that are contained within it, and we're going to look at packaging it up into NuGet packages that ultimately could be published to somewhere. So that's what we're going to try to achieve. And that's the end of my slides for now. So I'm going to come out of PowerPoint just now. And hopefully what you should see is my Visual Studio Code instance here. So just to talk you through what we spoke about before, these are the Visual Studio projects that I spoke about in that slide. So, and this is the solution file that ultimately we're going to build and compile against and run Cake for. So in preparation for this talk, I've already run those commands that I would have that I mentioned on my slide deck. So what I've done is it's created this .NET tools.json file. So this is the manifest file where you can pin to a specific version of a tool. And then when you run .NET tool restore, it will ensure that that specific version of the tool that you requested is installed, giving you that repeatable, reliable, maintainable build. So I've already done that, and that was just in the interest of time. So what we need, once we've got .NET, once we've got the .NET tool installed, what we can do is we can come down here and we can run .NET Cake. Now, obviously this isn't going to do anything at the minute, but what it will do is it will tell us what version of cake that we've got available to us. And obviously it'll have some ASCII art because the world needs more ASCII art. But it'll always tell me it's got, I'm running the version that I expected it to be running, and I'm ready to go with my orchestration process that I'm trying to facilitate here. So, like I say, it doesn't do anything yet because there's nothing for it to do. We need to give it an entry point. So the entry point for Cake by default is a build.cake file, and that's where you put your the orchestration steps, those tasks that we defined in that graph that I showed you before. So what we can do in here is we need to start creating that that script, and what we're going to do is we're going to build it up in stages. So the entry point for Cake is a method that that provides, which is called run target. So that run target basically runs one of those tasks that we specified within that graph. So I need to be able to, or I can control which target I want to run. And that's typically done by taking an input argument when we run Cake. Now, what Cake provides is the concept of an input argument alias, where we can grab an alias, an argument called target, and if we don't have a value, we can provide it a value. So that's a long-winded way of saying that if I accept an input argument from Cake at the command line, depending on based on what's passed in, I will either do the target that was requested, or I will use the default one. So what we can do then is, I've just seen a question pop up, so I'm going to address that because it is kind of pivotal. So thanks to Dougal for that. So the question was, why would I use Cake instead of an Azure DevOps pipeline? It isn't an and or situation. You would use Cake while you are using Azure DevOps within a pipeline. So rather than define your individual tasks within an Azure DevOps pipeline, you define those tasks within your Cake script, and then you have a single step within your Azure DevOps pipeline, which is to run your build process. The reason for that is twofold, or there's several reasons that you want to do that, but the main one is that I, as a developer, can run the build locally on my machine. So I can run the build in the exact same way that it would be run on Azure DevOps. Or if you also wanted to run your build on other CI systems because you want to make sure that you've got a broad spectrum of analysis being performed, then again, it's the same build process that runs on Azure DevOps, or it runs on TeamCity, or it runs on AppVeyor. But the main one is that it's the same build process that will be run locally on my machine as it is that will before when you push the commit and it runs on Azure DevOps. So hopefully that addresses that question. So if we cast your mind back to the build workflow that I defined earlier, I'm going to start stubbing those out. So I'm going to start creating those tasks as the entry points for the build process. So the first one that we had was a clean task. So these don't actually do anything at the minute. I'm kind of stubbing them out so that we can start to come back and fill them in. We had a restore task. We had a build task. We had a unit test task. We had then a package task as well. So I'm going to put package task. And then because of what I defined on line 1, where I said that my default argument is going to be called default, what we'll do is we'll create that default task. So in here, we will put default. So now that I've stubbed out those entry points, if I now come down here and attempt to run Cake, again, it's not going to do anything. But now that we've started to create what's really known under the hood as a directed acyclical graph of tasks within our Cake script, what we'll see is that it's now at least attempted the default task. So again, it doesn't do anything, but we're starting to put the building blocks in play of how we can start to put those things together. So if I go back to this task and I change it slightly and I say is dependent on, so this is where we start to put those arrows in play. So all those arrows that I had in play in my slide is I said that a task is dependent on another task. So in this case, I could, for example, say that the default task is dependent on the package task. So just to illustrate what that means is if I run the same cake command again, it's still not going to do anything, but the difference now is that the default task now ensured that the package task was done as well. So what that means is that as we define these dependencies and we make one task depend on another task, Cake will look at all of the tasks. It'll make sure that each one of those tasks is executed exactly once and in the order that satisfies all of those dependencies. Now, some folks out there might be wondering, well, I'm taking a dependency on a magic string. Essentially, I've said that this this default task is dependent on this magic task or this magic string called package. So if I had a typo here, then that obviously wouldn't work. So that's a fair point. But what we can do, if you prefer, is we can make this we can make our package task, a variable, so that when we take a dependency on it, we can say at this point, we're no longer taking the dependency on a magic string, but we run the exact same thing again, and it's going to do the exact same thing as it was before, but we've got a little bit more reliance that we're taking a dependency on a symbol at this point as opposed to a magic string. So there's flexibility in how you start putting all these things together. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to further extend the dependency graph that I have here. Now I'm just going to do it with magic strings because it's a little bit less typing. But I'm going to say that the package task is dependent on the test task. I'm going to say that the test task is dependent on the build task. I'm going to say that the build task is dependent on two things. So what we said was that the build task was going to be dependent on the NuGet restore step. And it's also going to be dependent on the clean step. So it's us cleaning up the artifacts from the build and making sure that it's a repeatable, reliable, and resilient build. So with that change in play, if I run the same .NET Cake command again, still not going to do anything. We're not doing any compilation. We're not doing any work at this point. But what we will start to see is that the default task is dependent on package. Package is dependent on task. Test is dependent on build, and build is dependent on clean and restore. So Cake is making sure that each of those entry points is fulfilled. Now, what we can do, depending on how you orchestrate it with a CI system, you can then add in a specific target. So let's say, for example, I have a target. I only wanted to run the test task. Oh, I've got no. Why did that not work? Could not execute because the specified command file .NET Cake. Why did that not work? I was fully expecting that to work. Target equals test. Target, argument, target. Have I not got a space? Well, that's what the problem is. I don't have a space. Let's try that again. Sorry, couldn't see my terminal window was slightly off, so I didn't see that there wasn't a space. So I changed the entry point there, and I changed the entry point to be the test target. So you'll see at this point that the default task wasn't executed and the package task wasn't executed. So it allows me, Cake allows me to run specific tasks dependent on what I'm doing at that point in time. And I can change that slightly again by using the exclusive flag. So what that will do is, if I've got a specific task where I'm iterating on something, I'm making lots of changes on one specific piece of my build orchestration, then I can run just that task and not all of the other ones. So it just helps to speed up the development process in terms of defining what that build is and how it comes together. So the one that we want to look at then, so now that we've got all the pieces in play, we can run Cake, let's start to actually do some work. So let's start with the restore task. So in order to do the build of my Visual Studio projects here, I need to pull in some NuGet packages. So I need to take ownership of that part of the process. Now in Visual Studio, if I open the solution in Visual Studio will automatically restore those packages for me. It knows what it needs to do in order to perform the build, the compilation within Visual Studio. But as soon as I go to a CI system, or I go to the command line and start orchestrating these things, I need to take ownership of those things to ensure that they're done in the order that I need them to do. Need them to be done. So what Cake provides is another method, the does method. So in here, I can start to do some work. So this just takes a lambda where I actually then start doing that work. So what I mean by that is Cake out of the box provides a number of what we refer to as aliases for doing work. So the thing that I want to do in this restore is I want to run the .NET CLI with the restore command. Now I absolutely could do that with just a straight up PowerShell script, or I could write that as a bash script. I could do that quite easily. But then I have to know all of the arguments that need to be passed in. I need to know all the things that need to be done to facilitate that. So one of the things that the Cake aliases comes with is the concept of a IntelliSense that it will appear within Visual Studio Code. So in here, I get information about, well, what do I need to do in order to run the .NET Core Restore alias? So all the IntelliSense is there. I've got settings I can pass in, but the default one is it needs to know the folder that the solution lives in so that it can then do the restore. So what I'll do here is I'll create just a variable called solution folder. I'll go back up to the top here and I'll create a new one called solution folder. I'm going to get there in the end. And I'm just going to say that my solution lives in the source folder. So you can see in the left-hand side here, the source folder is where everything lives. So if I point .NET Restore at that, then it will restore those NuGet packages. Let's just clear this out and let's remove this. And let's change the entry point. So I'm now going to run the restore task. So this is then going to do the work, which is to run the .NET CLI with the restore command, passing in the path to the solution, where the solution folder lives. Now, again, I could have done all of that at the command line, or I could have done it in PowerShell, but there's things I would have had to figure out. Some of that work is done for you with the aliases that you ship in with Cake. Now, what it's telling us here is there's obviously all the projects are updated. There's nothing to store. That's because I ran through the demo before coming onto the stream. So it's already been done. But now that it has been done, the important thing, and this is really why we are attempting to do this work, is that this build orchestration process is now starting to be essentially documented. So if we run the build again, it's going to ensure that that restore step is done at the right time to make sure that the build works as expected. So if we go to the next step, we can then start looking at the build. So what do we need to do within the build in order to compile our Visual Studio solution? So it stands to reason that if we had a .NET Core restore alias, then there'll also be a .NET Core build alias, and that absolutely is. So again, looking at IntelliSense, we need a path to where the solution or the project lives, but we can also start to control other elements of the build process as well. And that comes through the, I'm going to get this right, .NET build settings. So we can start to control the finer points of what the .NET Core build command will do. So you might ask, well, why do we need to do that? The interesting thing about the .NET CLI build command is that out of the box, it will also do a restore. So running .NET Core or .NET build will also, under the hood, do a restore. Now, what I've said is that we should own all of the parts of the build process. So I don't want the .NET Core build command to do the restore for me. I've already done it. So what we get within the .NET Core build settings class is we get the option to override that. And we can say that, actually, I don't want you to do the restore because I've already done it, and that is met by this dependency. So by putting that in play, and we change the entry point, this time around, it will run .NET Core restore because we need to, because it's part of the process, but then it's going to go to the next step, which is the build. So at this point, we will see it looking for the solution file, it'll find all the projects, and it builds them. Now, obviously, this is a contrived example. I don't have any errors because all code compiles, but if there were any errors at this point, those would be output and shown to you at the command line. So going one step further again, if I go down to my test task, again, it kind of stands to reason that if there was a .NET Core build, then there's ultimately going to be a .NET Core test, and there absolutely is. And then there will be a set of .NET Core test settings we also control. So the .NET CLI also tries to be helpful in this respect for us as well. So when we run .NET Core test, it will actually do a build as well. And it will, depending on how it's set up, it'll also do a restore. Now, I've taken ownership of that. So I also need to go into here and I can say, well, no build equals true as well. So again, we're documenting everything that we need to do to make sure that our build works the way that we want it to. So I feel I'm laboring the point a little bit. I just want to make sure that this is coming across the way that we want it to. So this time I'm going to run the test target. It's going to run the .NET restore, it's going to run the .NET build, and then it's going to run our unit tests. Now again, this is a contrived example. All of my unit tests pass because, well, it wouldn't be a very good demo if it didn't, but we're running tests at this point, and then we'll see at the end of this that all of our unit tests have been executed and they all passed. So there was 3 passed, 0 skipped, with a total of 3 successful. So we're making good progress in terms of the build process that we're trying to put in play here. So the next thing that we need to do is if I go back to here and I borrow this, I'm just going to borrow this again. So that's really not what I wanted. I'm going to take that out. So in here, we had a .NET Core test alias. So we're now at the packaging step, so that there's going to be a .NET Core pack settings as well. So the thing that we can do different here is that we want to control where those generated NuGet packages end up. So again, through the settings class, I can take ownership of that. I can say that I want to put my generated NuGet packages to a specific folder. So I can go back to the top here and I can say var output folder. And I can say that I'm going to want to put it into a artifacts. So that's where I want my generated files to go to. So at the minute, at the top level here, I don't have a dot artifacts folder. I don't have an artifacts folder. I did say artifacts, I did. So I don't currently have an artifacts folder. But if I run my package task at this point, what we'll see is it'll go through that entire process again. It'll do the restore, it'll do the build, it'll do the test, but then now we're going to do the packaging step as well. So what's going to happen by virtue of the way that .NET Pack works is that the .NET Pack will create the artifacts folder for us. So what we'll see on the left-hand side here is that artifacts folder will be created, and into that artifacts folder, here are the 2 NuGet packages. One contains the console library that we had, and the other is the .NET Global Tool version of the thing that we're compiling as well. So this looks quite good in the sense that it's all worked. We've done our unit tests, we've done our restore, we've done our build, and we've generated the packages, and ultimately we could take those and publish them somewhere. However, there's one thing missing in this scenario, and it goes back to what I described before, in that we need to take ownership of the parts of the build process to make sure that they work the way that we expect them to. Now, this artifacts folder was created for us by the .NET Pack command, but we can't really rely on that. We need to own that part of the process so that, again, we know that it will work and it will always work the way that we want it to. So what we can do in our clean task that we have up here is that we can take ownership of the creation of that. So there's an alias within Cake called clean directory. So what we can do with the clean directory alias is we can provide it a list of folders, or in this case, I'm just going to pass it a single one. But I'm going to say that I want my build process to own the creation of that artifacts folder. So to let you see that happening, if I run the clean task directly, what it's going to do is it's actually going to do two things. The first thing it's going to do is it's going to make sure that that artifacts folder is empty and that there's nothing in it. But it's also going to make sure that if for some reason that artifacts folder gets removed, the clean directory is going to make sure that it goes back. So that's important because, again, I keep stressing it, but it's that repeatable, reliable, and resilient build process. We own the individual parts of the build process, making sure that everything is set up the way that we want it to. So if I go back and run just .NET Cake, so I've removed the entry point now. So that directed acyclical graph of all of those tasks are now in play now. It's going to run the default task, which runs package, which runs test, which runs build, which runs clean, which runs restore. So all of those pieces are now running, such that the output of this build is now 2 NuGet packages that we could ultimately publish somewhere. But the important thing is that this build process that we've just defined now, we could very quickly add this into Azure DevOps, as per the question from Dougal. We could take a very simple Azure DevOps pipeline, which is simply run .NET Cake, or we could put it into Circle CI, or we could put it into TeamCity, or we could put it into AppWare. It's the same entry point, and that entry point is simply to run Cake, because all of the other work that's done as part of this build is done within the Cake script. So this Cake script is one that would go into your source control. It would go along with the repository. So as you need to make modifications to it, as you need to make changes, as you need to extend it to do other parts of the build process, it goes along with the repository. So I'm hoping that this has illustrated how Cake can be used as a build orchestration tool. But one of the things I wanted to highlight is that as we are stubbing this out, as we're creating this, we've had the benefit of IntelliSense within Visual Studio Code to provide some help with that. But there's always things that don't quite work the way we expect them to. So what would be great is that as we are creating our build script, it would be really useful if we could just debug it. And that's absolutely what you can do. So I'm just going to hit F5 here. And I set a breakpoint there, and I set it on my clean directory alias here. So what's going to happen is that Cake is going to be invoked in a debuggable way, which means that it will then allow us to step into the code. So what we're seeing here is it's a breakpoint now that I've then got the full capabilities of the standard debugging functionality within Visual Studio Code. So if I wanted to see what my output folder currently was, then I absolutely can do that. If I wanted to step into this, I absolutely could. Or if I wanted to see other more complicated parts of my build to see how they're working, then you have the ability to debug into that when you're running it locally. So the benefit there is that you don't have to make a change to a build pipeline, commit it to source control, wait for all the VMs and Azure DevOps to spin up to then ultimately fail. You then have to look at the logs to see what went on. You can do all of that iteration steps locally on your own machine with the benefit of debugging. So it's a really powerful feature. It was one that was a feature that was always asked for in the early days of Cake, and it is now possible for you to do that. Absolutely, it is. So with that, I'm going to jump back to my slides here. I just wanted to talk about a couple of additional. I should have started a specific slide. Apologies for that. So in terms of what's next with Cake, or what else can I do with this? What I've shown today is what comes out of the box with Cake. But Cake also has a number of extensibility options in terms of things that we refer to as add-ins. So let's say that as a part of your build process, when you push a package to NuGet.org, as an example, maybe you want to announce to the world that that package is now ready to be consumed. So there is a Cake add-in that allows you to send tweets. So that's what we do as part of our Cake build process. As soon as we do a release, as soon as the build succeeds, as soon as the packages are published to NuGet, we use the Cake.Twitter add-in to send a message via the official Cake Twitter account to let folks know that there is a new version. So there are lots of add-ins for different things. There are over 200 Cake add-ins in what we refer to as the Cake Contrib organization on GitHub. So genuinely, if there's anything you can typically think that you'd want to do as part of your build process, there is an add-in that will allow you to do that. The other side of it, from a scripting point of view, is that what I showed today was here's the build.cake file. Now, as your builds grow in complexity, the amount of code that you have in there is going to grow, obviously. So what you can do is there is the concept of having, you can break your script up into different cake scripts. So you can segregate them, compartmentalize them, and have different functionality in different cake scripts. And then you can use the load preprocessor directive to bring those cakes into one. Now, where that naturally takes us towards is things like what we refer to as the cake.recipe package. So cake.recipe is a NuGet package that I am one of the maintainers on. It is a very opinionated set of cake scripts that do all of the repeatable things over and over and over again. So you can use the same NuGet package, which is a set of cake scripts that you can then use on multiple projects. So as you extend the build to have different functionality, then you extend, you update it in one place in this NuGet package, then you reuse it across all of your projects that you're building with it. So it's a really powerful feature. The other side of it is there's the concept of modules. So everything in Cake is pretty much driven by an IOC container. So if you want to modify or extend or change the functionality of Cake, then you absolutely can do that. If something doesn't work the way you want it to, or you want to add additional functionality, then modules is where you can go. So there's a number of modules out there in the community as well. The one that I've identified here is the NPM module. So if you wanted to install an NPM tool as part of your build process, so let's say you needed to use Gulp or you needed to use Yarn or something like that, then you could use the Cake NPM module to ensure that that tool from NPM at a specific version is installed and ready to go as part of your build process. So again, you're owning all the different constituent parts of the build to make sure that it works the way you want it to. So with that, I'm going to say thanks for joining, because that's me at the end of the talk. If you do have any questions, feel free to ask on the YouTube chat that we have here, or you can get me on those the Twitter handle there and the GitHub handle there. So that's all I have. So yeah, thank you very much for coming along. I hope it's been useful.
No, that was really, really great. Thank you. That was awesome. I'll let folks oh, it's already sharing my screen. Don't want to do that. We'll let folks give some time to ask questions in the chat. But that was really great. It was I'm a .NET dev, I'm a C# dev, so it was good to see how you can configure all that stuff in code in C#. Yeah,
and that's one of the reasons I started working on the Cake project. Prior to using Cake, I was a maintainer of the Saki project, which is a PowerShell build automation tool. The problem that I had there was that I was the only one on the team who knew how to write PowerShell. So one of the benefits of writing your build script in C# in Cake is that you then don't have to do the mental mind switch between the C# code that I was doing for the application to then have to do PowerShell for the build process. So it was a really powerful argument for using Cake when I first started using it.
Yeah, it's there. It's in code. It's in source control. It's in all of those places that it should be, and it's just part of the code base, which is really nice. We did also have a comment earlier from Augusto that was less YAML.
Yeah, so, I saw that one fly past. It's absolutely right. I mean, it kind of goes to Dougal's point as well, that you can do some of these things in Azure pipelines, but then you have to look at the YAML. You'll see multiple commits where you're just changing the formatting of the YAML to make it work. There's lots of things that you have to jump through in order to make that work. If you can remove that and put it into a language that you're more familiar with, then it's much easier to do the build process as part of that.
Sweet, and it's really cool that you mentioned earlier you can ping it off to DevOps, you can put it to Octopus Deploy or any of those places. Can you have it do your front end build stuff as well? So if you've got like a front end build alongside your .NET build. So
you can. So I mean, I do. Let's put it that way. Mm-hmm. From some of the front end stuff that we do, we use Gulp as a mm-hmm. JavaScript build automation tool. So in my head, it makes sense to do the the core portions of the build process for the front end stuff in the language that makes the most sense. So for us, it's Gulp. It could be Grunt. It could be whatever it is you want to do. But I then include the Gulp build as part of my overall build. So my overall build for the website has a C# ASP.NET component, and it has some front end stuff. So I do a Cake build, which will do the build of the C# stuff. It'll then call out to Gulp, and then it'll put everything together to combine it all. So I use Cake as the higher level build orchestration tool.
Yeah, so it does does all the sub build, packages it up to whatever it needs to be packaged, and then pings it off to where it needs to go.
Correct. Absolutely.
Sweet.
Absolutely.
So we've got a wee question from Dougal, which is, would you recommend Cake for deploying ARM templates?
So the short answer is, I personally don't know. So let me put it this way. Pretty much anything that you can orchestrate, you absolutely can do it with Cake. Whether you should do it with Cake, I don't know. There might be some other folks from the Cake team in the chat room. I saw, and you mentioned Augusto. Augusto is one of the maintainers of the Cake project as well. If you wanted to follow up, Dougal, with a question in the discussion section of the Cake GitHub repository, then we could absolutely get that answered. I don't use ARM templates, so I can't answer that. Sorry.
Cool, no worries. And yeah, just folks with clapping emojis, and that it sounds really cool. So I think that was really, really useful for folks. And what we're going to do is we're going to add Stephanie back in because we are just about finished up. But we did miss a question earlier. Hi, Stephanie.
Hi.
Thanks for sticking around.
Yep.
We had a question earlier that we did miss, as well as we had some feedback that it was a really nice talk, and again, lots of clapping emojis. But we did miss a question that was, any plans to link up with Mozilla?
Right. So I want to sort of clarify. So when I'm talking about how Edge and the Edge team and the Chrome team work together, like the Edge team was working on the control stuff, and we share a browser rendering engine with Chromium, and so it made sense to sort of link up and share resources that way. And then we're not sort of working in a silo. Like our explainers and plans have been presented in standards groups with folks from Mozilla and Apple, and they've sort of signaled their interest that way. And then a lot of the like standards work will obviously sort of have to happen as a group, so it won't just be like Chrome or Edge sort of pushing that. And I don't know where exactly Mozilla stands at the moment with the layoffs that happened for the platform team, but even though we're not like at the moment directly working with them, we're still engaging with them in standards groups.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you.
Yep.
Well, I just wanted to say thanks to both of you for joining us. It's our first meetup virtually. It's our first meetup in quite a while. So you have been the guinea pigs for us using new tech. So thanks for that. And yeah, it's been really great to see those talks. And Stephanie, you've definitely travelled the farthest. But Andrew and I just chatted. We were saying it's been really good. I'm in Glasgow. Andrew's through in Edinburgh. Gary, you're up in Aberdeen. So we've got quite a good cross-section of Scotland. Maybe folks can leave comments in the chat for like where in Scotland you are. But it's been good to get a good mix of folks from all over the place. So that was really great. Thanks. I'll say goodbye now to you folks, and Andrew's going to let us know a little bit about what we've got in kind of upcoming meetups. But thank you so much again for joining us. That was great.
Yep.
Thank you very much.
Thanks.
Okay, so just some next steps from myself. So we're really keen to make this as good as we can for everyone. To that effect, we're going to be sending out a survey, so we'll be sharing that on Meetup and Twitter. We're really, really close to confirming our next two speakers, and the next event will be on the 7th of April on a Wednesday, so keep your eye out for that. If you yourself feel like speaking at a future meetup, please do reach out. Obviously, you can hit us up on @ScottishDevs. There's also obviously all the other platforms that we're on, Facebook and LinkedIn, and Meetup, so please do reach out. And we can accommodate different formats. We're always looking into more innovative ways to getting more people involved. So things like lightning talks, panels, discussions of that ilk. We can be really flexible about that. And I think lastly, if there's any news, anything cool going on in Scotland in the kind of tech sector, we're really, really keen to hear from you. So please reach out and let us know, and we'll figure out a way of sharing that with our community. So Carol, I think you just had one or two, please say, to round up.
Yeah, it's really just thanks everyone for speaking, for joining us, for having patience with us, figuring out StreamYard and the new tech. And it's it's great to have the meetup back. And I mean, I'm optimistic to think we might have an in real life meetup later in the year. I don't know, but we'll at least keep the virtual ones going for a while. And it'd be good to get folks' feedback, like, because Scotland is, it's hard to get between the cities if for meetups after work. Would folks rather they were virtual, or we done a mixture when things are normal, if I dare say that? Yeah, it'd be great just to get folks' feedback and what you would like to see in future meetups. And we've had comments saying we've got Richard's joining us from Fife, so that's more representation of other places in Scotland, and some nice comments saying it's good to see the meetups back. So it's really great for folks to join us and to contribute in the chat too. So I think that's it from us. So we'll see you on, was it 7th of April? And do stay in touch in the meantime. Thanks. Bye-bye.
Bye.